Next time, leave the little girl at home. The words landed across the conference room like a slap. Ethan Cole didn't answer immediately. He looked at his 6-year-old daughter, Mia, sitting quietly in the corner with a coloring book in her lap. She hadn't interrupted the meeting. She hadn't made a sound. She had simply been waiting, patiently for her father to finish. Yet somehow, to the people sitting around that table, her presence had become a problem. And this wasn't just any meeting. It was a meeting that could determine the future of Ethan's company. $900 million sat on the table. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. Have you ever had to choose, in a single moment, between something you spent years building and the person you built it for? Stay with me, because Ethan was about to face exactly that choice. And if stories like this mean something to you, stories about people who refuse to trade their dignity for money, hit subscribe before we go further. You're going to want to see where this one lands. 6 years earlier, Ethan had been a young father trying to build a future for his daughter. Now at 32, he was the founder and CEO of a fast-growing technology company that had earned the respect of customers across the industry. His greatest achievement, however, wasn't the company. It was Mia. After losing his wife 3 years earlier, Ethan had learned how to balance investor calls with school pickups, board meetings with bedtime stories, and the pressure of running a growing company with the responsibility of raising his daughter alone. It wasn't easy, but he never complained. Mia was the reason he kept moving forward. That morning, her school unexpectedly closed because of a plumbing problem. Ethan tried to find a babysitter, but everyone he trusted was unavailable. So he did the only thing he could. He brought Mia with him. Before entering the meeting, Ethan had made sure the investors knew she would be there. Their assistant had assured him it wouldn't be a problem. He believed them. He was wrong. An assistant led Ethan and Mia into an elegant conference room where members of the Hawthorne family were already waiting. Expensive watches, tailored suits, confident smiles. The room went strangely quiet when they saw Ethan and the little girl beside him. One man glanced at Ethan's simple jacket and smirked. Another exchanged an amused look with a relative. A woman leaned back in her chair and whispered something that made several people chuckle. Ethan noticed. He said nothing. He simply pulled out a chair for Mia near the corner of the room, handed her the coloring book from her backpack, and took his seat. He had come there to discuss a business partnership worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And he was prepared. His company's numbers were strong. His presentation was clear. His answers were backed by facts. For a while, everything remained professional. Then one of the Hawthorne brothers looked toward Mia. I didn't expect the CEO to bring his daughter to a $900 million meeting. A few people laughed politely. Another executive added, running a company is demanding enough. I can't imagine doing it alone with a child. Ethan remained calm. Sometimes life doesn't give us perfect circumstances, he said. You simply learn to do your best with what you have. But the comments didn't stop. An older member of the family leaned back in his chair. So, you're a single father? Yes. He shook his head. Business requires complete focus. Family responsibilities usually slow people down. Ethan glanced toward Mia. She had looked up from her coloring book. She could tell something had changed. Ethan gave her a reassuring smile before turning back to the table. My daughter has never held me back, he said evenly. If anything, she's the reason I work harder and make better decisions. The room went quiet again. Ethan continued his presentation. He refused to argue. He refused to let their assumptions distract him. He had spent years proving himself through his actions. By the end of the afternoon, every major point of the partnership had been discussed. The legal teams had reviewed the documents. The financial projections had been approved. The deal was ready. A thick contract was placed in front of Ethan. If you sign today, one of the Hawthorne executives said, the funds will be released immediately. $900 million. The kind of opportunity most entrepreneurs could spend their entire lives chasing. Ethan looked down at the contract. Then came the final insult. There's just one thing. Another family member said with a smile. Next time, leave the little girl at Home. Investors expect a CEO to look professional, not like a father on babysitting duty. Laughter filled the room again. Mia looked at her father, confused. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had simply sat quietly and waited. Ethan slowly closed the contract. The laughter stopped. He looked at the people sitting across from him. Then he looked at his daughter. And in that moment, Ethan Cole had a choice. He could sign the contract and walk away with $900 million. Or he could walk away from the biggest deal of his career. He chose his daughter. And what happened next would leave everyone in that room stunned. But to understand why Ethan was willing to walk away from $900 million, we have to go back to the beginning. To understand why Ethan was willing to walk away from $900 million, we have to go back 3 years. Ethan had never imagined that becoming a successful CEO would also mean learning how to be a single father. 3 years earlier, he lost his wife. And suddenly, everything changed. He had a young daughter who still needed her mother, and Ethan had to find a way to keep moving forward while carrying a loss he could never undo. There were no perfect circumstances. There were no easy days. There were only school pickups, bedtime stories, investor calls, business decisions, and the constant responsibility of making sure his daughter knew she was loved. But Ethan never complained. Instead, he turned his attention to the company he was building. What started as a growing technology business slowly became something much bigger. Ethan became its founder and CEO, earning the respect of customers across the industry. Newspapers began describing him as a brilliant entrepreneur. But Ethan knew the truth. His greatest achievement wasn't the company. It was the life he was building for his daughter. Every decision he made was influenced by the same question. Would this create a better future for her? That was why the opportunity with the Hawthorne family meant so much. Their family represented enormous wealth and influence. A partnership with them could change the future of Ethan's company almost overnight. The numbers were extraordinary. $900 million. Enough money to accelerate the company's growth, expand its reach, and give Ethan and his daughter a level of financial security he had never allowed himself to take for granted. And the closer the deal came, the more Ethan believed he had finally reached the moment he'd spent years working toward. He had built something valuable. He had proven himself. And now some of the most powerful investors in the country were prepared to put hundreds of millions of dollars behind his company. There was only one thing Ethan didn't fully understand yet. The Hawthorne family wasn't judging his company alone. They were judging him. From the moment he entered their conference room, they noticed his simple jacket. They noticed his daughter. And they noticed that the man sitting across from them wasn't the polished image they expected from a CEO about to receive a massive investment. At first, Ethan ignored the looks. He had learned long ago that people could make assumptions about him without knowing anything about his life. He simply focused on the numbers, his company's growth, his plans, his vision for the future. He believed that if the business was strong enough, none of the personal details would matter. But slowly, the Hawthorne family's questions revealed what they really thought. They questioned what it meant for Ethan to run a company while raising a child alone. They suggested that family responsibilities could slow a leader down. And when Ethan calmly explained that his daughter had never held him back, that she was actually the reason he worked harder and made better decisions, their doubts didn't disappear. They simply became quieter. Ethan didn't argue. He continued presenting his plans. He continued answering their questions. He continued believing that business should ultimately be about results, integrity, and trust. By the end of the meeting, the legal teams had reviewed the documents. The financial projections had been approved. The partnership was ready. The contract sat in front of Ethan. $900 million was only a signature away. Then the Hawthorne family made one final request. They told Ethan that next time, he should leave his daughter at home. They didn't see her as a little girl who had needed her father that morning. They saw her as something that made their CEO look less professional. And suddenly, Ethan understood something he hadn't wanted to believe. This wasn't simply about money anymore. It was about what kind of people he was preparing to build his company's future with. And for the first time, Ethan began to wonder whether the biggest opportunity of his life might also be the biggest mistake he could make. The room fell silent. Ethan looked down at the contract in front of him. $900 million. Then he looked toward Mia. She had stopped coloring. The little girl watched her father quietly, sensing that something had changed even though she couldn't understand why. Ethan gave her a reassuring smile. But inside, something had shifted. For the entire afternoon, he had remained calm. He had listened to their questions. He had answered every challenge. He had presented his company's growth, explained his plans, and shown them why the business deserved their investment. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. They weren't simply questioning his company. They were questioning him. They saw a single father and assumed he couldn't give his business everything it needed. They saw his daughter sitting quietly in the corner and somehow turned her presence into a weakness. Ethan thought about the life he had built. 3 years earlier, he had lost his wife. Since then, he had learned to balance running a growing company with raising his daughter alone. Board meetings became part of the same life as school pickups. Investor calls happened alongside bedtime stories. Business decisions had to exist alongside the simple responsibility of being there for Mia. It hadn't always been easy, but he had never allowed his circumstances to become an excuse. His daughter had never held him back. If anything, she had given him a reason to work harder. Now the people offering him $900 million wanted him to treat her like an embarrassment. Ethan looked back at the contract. The money could transform his company. It could accelerate everything he had spent years building. And all they wanted in return was a small promise. Next time, leave the little girl at home. For a moment, Ethan didn't move. He understood exactly what they were asking him to accept. Not simply a business condition. A message that his daughter could be tolerated as long as she remained invisible. Ethan slowly closed the contract. The sound seemed unusually loud in the silent room. "I'm grateful for the offer," he said calmly. Several executives nodded, expecting him to continue. "Your investment could help my company grow faster than I ever imagined." The confidence around the table returned. They thought he was going to sign. Then Ethan continued. "But growth means very little if it comes at the cost of self-respect." The smiles disappeared. Ethan looked around the table. "I built this company by treating people with dignity. That includes my employees, my customers, and my family." No one interrupted him. "If my daughter is seen as an embarrassment instead of someone worthy of kindness, then we are not the right partners." One of the executives frowned. "Are you really walking away from a $900 million deal?" Ethan didn't hesitate. He stood. He picked up Mia's backpack and walked over to his daughter. Then he held out his hand. Mia took it. "I'm walking towards something more valuable," Ethan said. "A business built on respect lasts longer than one built only on money." And just like that, Ethan walked out of the conference room with his daughter. Behind him, the unsigned contract remained on the table. $900 million. Gone. The room was left in stunned silence. Ethan had just walked away from the biggest business opportunity of his life, and he had no idea yet what that decision would set in motion. Ethan and Mia had barely left the building when the questions began. What had he been thinking? Why would any CEO walk away from $900 million? Had he made the biggest mistake of his career? For the next few days, people in the business world questioned Ethan's decision. Some called it a costly mistake. Others simply couldn't understand how a man could reject an investment of that size. $900 million was the kind of opportunity entrepreneurs spent their entire lives chasing, and Ethan had walked away from it. But Ethan didn't try to defend himself to every person who questioned him. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't release a statement explaining what had happened inside that conference room. He simply returned to his normal routine. Every morning, he drove Mia to school. Then he went to work. He met with his team. He reviewed projects. He made decisions. And at the end of the day, he went home in time to help Mia with her homework and read her a bedtime story. From the outside, it looked as though nothing had changed. But inside the company, his employees had noticed something important. Ethan's confidence hadn't disappeared. He He wasn't walking around regretting his decision. He wasn't acting like a man who had just destroyed his company's greatest opportunity. Instead, he reminded his team of something he had always believed. A business built on trust could survive setbacks. But a business built on compromised values would eventually lose its direction. His employees listened. They had watched him walk away from the money. Now, they were watching what he did afterward. And Ethan wasn't asking them to pretend the decision had been easy. He simply refused to let the loss of the deal change the principles that had built the company in the first place. Still, the consequences remained. The company had lost an enormous opportunity. There was no way around that. The Hawthorne investment could have accelerated their growth dramatically. Now Ethan would have to keep building without it. For a man who had spent years carrying the responsibility of his company and his daughter, that uncertainty was real. But he continued forward. He had made his choice, and he wasn't going to spend the rest of his life wishing he had chosen differently. Then, a few weeks later, something unexpected happened. News of what had happened inside the meeting quietly began spreading through industry circles. People learned that Ethan hadn't rejected the $900 million because his company was failing. He had rejected it because he refused to compromise his values. And that story reached people Ethan never expected to hear from. Several respected investors began reaching out, not because they felt sorry for him, because they admired the way he had handled himself. They saw something different in Ethan, a leader who had been given an extraordinary amount of money and still refused to trade his principles for it. To them, that wasn't weakness. It was character. It was leadership. And suddenly, the deal Ethan had lost wasn't the only opportunity available to him. A different door was beginning to open, one Ethan hadn't even known was there. But this time, before accepting anything, Ethan would have to decide whether these new investors truly shared the values he had fought so hard to protect. The call Ethan expected never came. Instead, the first message arrived from an investor he had never met. Then another. Then another. At first, Ethan assumed they were simply curious about the controversy surrounding the Hawthorne deal. After all, the story had spread through industry circles. People were talking about the CEO who had walked away from $900 million. Some thought he had made a terrible mistake. Others couldn't understand how anyone could reject an investment of that size. But then Ethan began to notice something different about the messages he was receiving. These investors weren't calling to criticize him. They were asking to meet. One of them wanted to learn more about his company's future. Another wanted to understand why he had rejected the Hawthorne partnership. And a third simply told him that they admired the way he had handled himself. Ethan was surprised. He hadn't expected admiration. He had expected consequences. He had spent days reminding himself that the company would have to move forward without the enormous investment that could have changed everything. But now, something he hadn't anticipated was happening. His decision was attracting attention from people who valued something beyond money. They weren't interested in feeling sorry for him. They were interested in the character behind the company. A leader who had been offered an extraordinary amount of money and still refused to compromise. His principles was rare, and these investors believed that mattered. One afternoon, Ethan sat across from a small group of them and listened as they asked about his vision. They wanted to understand how he ran the company, how he treated his employees, what kind of culture he wanted to build, and, most importantly, what kind of future he wanted for the business. For the first time since the Hawthorne meeting, Ethan didn't feel like he was defending a decision. He felt like someone was actually trying to understand it. Eventually, the discussions became serious. The investors offered Ethan a partnership. It wasn't $900 million. It wasn't even close to the original offer. But there was something different about it. They offered mutual respect, complete transparency, and the freedom to grow the company without sacrificing the culture Ethan had spent years building. Ethan didn't accept immediately. He thought about the Hawthorne family. He remembered the contract sitting in front of him. He remembered the laughter. He remembered Mia sitting quietly in the corner with her coloring book. And he remembered the choice he had made when the money was sitting right in front of him. This new opportunity wasn't asking him to make that choice again. It was offering him something the first deal never could. A partnership built on shared values. Ethan finally accepted. The investment was smaller. The road ahead would require more work. But for the first time, Ethan understood something important. Walking away from the $900 million hadn't ended his company's future. It had forced him to find the right people to build that future with. And that realization changed everything. Because Ethan had spent years believing that success meant getting the biggest opportunity in the room. Now, he understood that sometimes the greatest opportunity is the one that respects what you refuse to sacrifice. The new partnership was smaller than the one Ethan had walked away from. There was no $900 million investment waiting to transform the company overnight. No masiva non cement. No instant expansion. Instead, Ethan had to keep building the company the same way he had built it from the beginning. One decision at a time. One customer at a time. One employee at a time. The critics hadn't disappeared either. There were still people who believed Ethan had made a terrible mistake. They looked at the smaller investment and saw proof that he had lost. Why reject $900 million only to accept something far less? Why make business harder when the easier path had been sitting directly in front of him? Ethan heard the questions, but he didn't allow them to change what he believed. He reminded his employees that a business built on trust could survive setbacks. A business built on compromised values, however, would eventually lose its direction. Those words weren't just something he said to make his team feel better. He believed them, and now he had to live by them. The company continued working. Ethan remained focused on the future. The new investors gave him something the Hawthorne family never had: mutual respect, complete transparency, and the freedom to grow the company without sacrificing the culture he had worked so hard to create. It wasn't the fastest path, but it was a path Ethan could believe in. At home, life remained simple. Ethan still drove Mia to school. He still helped with her homework. He still made time for bedtime stories. Those ordinary moments reminded him why he had made the decision in the first place. One evening, after putting Mia to bed, Ethan returned to his office and looked over the company's plans. There was still a long road ahead. The company wasn't where it could have been with the Hawthorne money, but it was still standing. More importantly, it was still his. The people working beside him still trusted him. The culture they had built together was still intact. And the partnership they had chosen was based on something stronger than money. For the first time, Ethan stopped measuring his decision by the size of the investment he had rejected. He started measuring it by what he had refused to lose: his daughter, his integrity, and the principles that had guided him from the beginning. The $900 million had been enormous, but it had never been the only path forward. Ethan simply hadn't known that until he was brave enough to walk away. And what he didn't know yet was that the company he was fighting to preserve was about to become far bigger than he had ever imagined. The years that followed changed everything. The smaller investment Ethan had accepted wasn't the kind of deal that made headlines. It didn't transform the company overnight, but it gave Ethan something more important: room to grow without sacrificing the values that had built the company in the first place. Slowly, the business began expanding. New opportunities appeared. The company entered new countries. More customers came. More employees joined the team. And the company Ethan had once feared might struggle without the Hawthorne family's money was becoming stronger than ever. Hundreds of people would eventually work there. Customers trusted the company. Employees believed in its culture. And Ethan's reputation continued to grow. Not because he had accepted the biggest investment, because he had refused to compromise himself to get it. One evening, Ethan stood looking over everything the company had become. For years, he had imagined what $900 million could have done. He had imagined the buildings, the expansion, the security, the opportunities for Mia. But now he understood something he hadn't been able to see that day in the Hawthorne conference room. The $900 million deal hadn't been his only chance. It had simply been the wrong chance. Walking away hadn't closed the door to his future. It had opened the right one. Ethan thought back to that conference room. The laughter, the contract, Mia sitting quietly with her coloring book, and the moment he had picked up her backpack and taken her hand. At the time, he hadn't known what would happen next. He hadn't known whether the company would succeed without the Hawthorne investment. He hadn't known whether another investor would ever believe in him. He had only known one thing. He wasn't willing to teach his daughter that money was more valuable than dignity. And now, years later, the results were standing in front of him. The company was bigger. The team was stronger. The business had expanded into new countries. And Ethan had built the future he wanted without giving up the principles that mattered most. That was when he finally understood the truth. He hadn't lost the $900 million deal. He had rejected the wrong future. And in doing so, he had made room for the right one. But there was still one person who hadn't heard Ethan's final answer to the question that had started everything. His daughter. Years had passed since the day Ethan walked away from the $900 million deal. The company had grown. It had expanded into new countries. It had hired hundreds of employees. And it had become one of the most trusted companies in its field. But Ethan never forgot how it all started. Not with the biggest investment, not with the most powerful family, but with a decision. A decision he had made while his 6-year-old daughter sat quietly beside him with a coloring book. One evening, Ethan and Mia stood together in their backyard, watching the sun slowly disappear beyond the horizon. Mia was older now, but she still remembered that day. After a quiet moment, she looked at her father. "Dad." "Yes, sweetheart. Do you ever wish you had taken that first deal?" Ethan smiled. Then he gently shook his head. "No." Mia looked at him. "Not even once. Not even once." He looked toward the sunset before continuing. "Money can build buildings, Mia, but character builds a life." She listened quietly. "If you stay true to your values," Ethan said, "the right opportunities will always find you." Mia smiled, and Ethan realized that the greatest lesson he had ever taught his daughter hadn't come from a business meeting. It hadn't come from a speech. It hadn't come from the success of his company. It had come from a choice he made when no amount of money could buy his integrity. He had walked away from $900 million. At the time, people thought he had lost. But years later, Ethan understood the truth. He hadn't lost the opportunity. He had chosen the right future. The future where his daughter never had to believe that her worth depended on whether powerful people approved of her. The future where his company could grow without sacrificing the values that made it worth building. And the future where Ethan could look back at the most difficult decision of his life without regret. The $900 million deal had been enormous, but it was never worth more than his character. And sometimes the most valuable thing a person can walk away from is the thing that asks them to become someone they were never meant to be. If this story meant something to you, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you want more stories about people who choose integrity over money and discover that the right decision can change everything, subscribe. Because sometimes walking away isn't the end of the story. If the right one begins.